Megan Parker had always been the type to chase adventure. From hiking through the dense forests of the Appalachian Mountains to backpacking through Europe, she thrived on the unknown, the unexplored, and the eerie. It wasn't surprising that, when her close friend Li Wei invited her to spend the summer in her family's ancestral home in rural China, Megan accepted without hesitation. Li Wei had grown up in the bustling city of Shanghai, but always spoke with reverence about her family's estate tucked away in the mountains. She often referred to it as the old house, and Megan had seen enough of Li Wei's photos to know it was grand and ancient. Towering wooden beams, sprawling courtyards, and sprawling gardens that seemed to spill into the wilderness itself. There was, of course, something strange about the invitation, though Megan couldn't put her finger on it. Li Wei was reserved about the details of the house's history, almost as though she was withholding something. At first, Megan assumed it was because the house was old, maybe haunted or full of strange family relics, as many ancient homes were. But when Megan had pressed her friend about the legends surrounding the house, Li Wei only smiled and said, "There's nothing there but stories. Don't worry about it." But the more Megan researched, the more intrigued she became. A small village near the house was known for its ghost stories, and people spoke in hushed tones about a haunting that had persisted for generations. The most chilling was the tale of a girl named Hēi Yǐng, the no-face girl, who would appear in the house's mirrors at night. Megan was skeptical of superstitions, dismissing them as folklore to entertain tourists, but a part of her wondered, why would Li Wei's family stay in such a place if the stories were true? In the end, it didn't matter. Megan was determined to experience this unknown part of the world, to breathe its air, to understand it. She was excited by the idea of spending a summer away from everything familiar and diving into a culture that felt rich with history. The warnings, even the cryptic legend, only fueled her curiosity. Chapter 1: The Broken Mirror. The manor stood proudly against the backdrop of rolling hills and dense woods. Its dark wooden exterior and ornate carvings made it appear as if it had been carved from the very mountains that surrounded it. Li Wei's family greeted Megan with warm hospitality, and despite the eeriness of the house, Megan felt strangely at home. It was when she was shown to her guest room that the first hint of unease began. The room was large, but it was the mirror hanging above the dresser that caught her attention. The glass was cracked, but not in a way that seemed accidental. No, this crack was deep, running in a jagged line across the center of the mirror, as though something had violently struck it. Li Wei didn't seem to notice Megan's gaze lingering on it. "Oh, that mirror is a bit old," she said quickly. "We don't really use it anymore." But Megan couldn't help but be drawn to it. There was something about that crack, something unsettling. But she pushed it to the back of her mind, chalking it up to superstition, and turned her attention to the rest of the room. The bed was large, draped with an intricately woven quilt, and the windows looked out into the lush garden below. That night, after a lovely dinner with Li Wei's family, Megan decided to retire early. She wasn't used to the slow, languid pace of country life, and the combination of jet lag and the weight of history pressing down on her made her feel drowsy. She didn't think much of it as she lay down beneath the heavy blankets, pulling the thick curtains shut against the night. But then around 2 a.m., she awoke suddenly. At first, she wasn't sure what had roused her. There was a strange stillness in the room, a kind of suffocating silence. Her heart was pounding in her chest for no apparent reason. Megan sat up, confused, and instinctively looked toward the guest room door, which was ajar. A faint light seemed to seep through the crack in the doorway. With a jolt, Megan realized something. She had been dreaming, but the dream had felt far too real. It was as though she had been transported to another place, a place darker, colder. Her breath quickened as she glanced toward the mirror, and then she saw it. The reflection of a face, pale, smooth, and featureless, had appeared in the glass. At first, she thought it was an illusion, a trick of the light, or maybe just her tired mind playing tricks. But when she blinked, the face remained, a haunting silhouette staring back at her. Megan felt a wave of nausea wash over her as she stared into the mirror. The face was so smooth it seemed unreal, as though the features had been erased, wiped away like chalk from a blackboard. It wasn't just the absence of features that unnerved her, it was the way the face seemed to float, disconnected from the rest of the world around it. Her breath came in short gasps, and for a moment, she was frozen, unable to move. But then the voice came, soft, almost like a whisper, yet so clear, it felt as though it had come from inside her mind. "Why did you break it?" Megan whipped her head around, heart hammering in her chest. But the room was empty. There was no one there. The only sound was the faint rustling of the wind outside. She turned back toward the mirror, but the featureless face had disappeared. She didn't know how long she stood there, shaking with fear, but when she finally turned to leave, the door handle wouldn't budge. Her pulse quickened again, and in a panic, she shoved against the door. It opened with a creak, and she stumbled into the hallway, breathing heavily. But as she took her first step, she swore she saw a shadow flit across the wall, someone or something moving just out of sight. Shivering, she rushed back to her room, locking the door behind her, and tried to shake off the feeling of being watched. The following days blurred together in a haze of unease. Megan tried to convince herself that the events of that night were simply a product of jet lag and overactive imagination. But the atmosphere in the house seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. Li Wei noticed it too, and there were moments when Megan caught her staring at the old mirror. Her face clouded with something Megan couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or deep-seated dread. At night, the whispers began. Soft murmurs echoed through the halls, growing louder with every passing hour. Megan had initially thought they were just the sounds of the house settling, but the more she listened, the more she began to feel that they were intentional. And then came the night of the third occurrence. At exactly 2 a.m., Megan awoke to a sharp, almost unbearable pressure in the room. It was as if the air had thickened, becoming dense, suffocating. Her body was frozen with a strange paralysis, and her heart pounded loudly in her ears. She wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't move. And then once again she saw it, the featureless face, not just in the mirror this time, but everywhere. It seemed to be watching her, closing in from every angle. She could hear the faint whisper in the back of her mind, a voice filled with sorrow, with anger. "Why did you break it?" The voice repeated, louder now. "Why?" With a scream, Megan bolted upright, gasping for air. The oppressive weight in the room lifted as suddenly as it had come, but she knew with terrible certainty that something had been unleashed. She had seen it. She had broken the barrier between the living world and the world of the curse. The next morning, after a sleepless night, Megan could no longer deny the reality of the haunting. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her hands trembled as she spoke to Li Wei's grandmother. The old woman's face was unreadable as Megan recounted the events of the past few days. Li Wei's grandmother nodded gravely. "The curse is old, child. It was placed long ago by a restless spirit, a girl named Hēi Yǐng who was betrayed, her life taken in a cruel way. Her reflection was broken, and she was trapped in that mirror. The curse lives on in the shards of broken glass. Those who disturb it awaken her, and she comes back." Megan's heart sank. "But how do I stop it? How do I fix this?" The old woman took Megan's hands, looking deeply into her eyes. "You can't undo what's been done. You've seen her now. The curse will follow you wherever you go." "But I don't want it," Megan whispered, her voice breaking. The grandmother held her gaze. "The curse will not rest until it has claimed what it seeks. Leave this place and never return." In the months that followed, Megan tried to return to her normal life. But the memories of those nights lingered, etched deep into her mind like the jagged crack that had once marred the mirror's surface. She felt as though a part of her had been left behind in that ancient house, still standing among the mountains, haunted by the faceless girl who had forever etched herself into Megan's reality. Nightmares became a constant presence. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that smooth, featureless face, heard the accusing whisper, "Why did you break it?" The words became a haunting refrain, echoing in her mind like a mantra of sorrow, a wound that would not heal. She'd wake, her heart racing, sweat soaking her sheets, and in the corner of her darkened bedroom, she swore she sometimes saw a faint silhouette, an unnatural shadow that didn't quite belong. Friends began to notice the changes in Megan. The way she flinched at mirrors, the exhaustion shadowing her eyes, the anxiety that lingered just beneath her usually adventurous spirit. They tried to help, but no one could understand. She stopped talking about her time in China altogether. Words couldn't convey the depth of her fear, the weight of the unknown that had latched onto her soul. In the quietest moments, Megan realized the true depth of Li Wei's grandmother's warning. The curse had become part of her, entwined with her essence, a shadow clinging to her every step. Wherever she went, she felt the presence like a phantom touch, a whisper of cold breath against her skin. One day, as she stood in front of a mirror, she noticed something that sent a chill through her veins. A hairline crack had begun to snake down the glass, an eerie reminder of the broken mirror in Li Wei's family home. Panic filled her, but she forced herself to stay calm, touching the surface lightly, as if the glass itself might speak back to her. In that moment, she understood with a dreadful certainty that there was no escape. The curse was embedded in her now, a part of her very reflection. From that day forward, Megan took down every mirror in her home. She avoided polished surfaces, turned away from glinting windows, and refused to glance at any reflection, fearful of what she might see staring back at her. She even avoided pictures, terrified of capturing that shadow lurking just behind her, the faceless girl who might someday step forward from the edges of the frame. Years passed, and Megan learned to live in the uneasy truce of avoidance, always looking forward but never daring to look back. But every so often in the dead of night, she'd feel the familiar chill and hear the faintest of whispers, a reminder of the past she could never outrun. And somewhere in a grand, weathered manor nestled in the misty hills of rural China, the cracked mirror waited, its fractured surface empty and silent, bearing only the imprint of the curse, waiting patient for the next to come.